I never thought the day I taught my son to drive my old Civic down a gravel road in Muskoka would be the same memory I'd replay in my head while sitting in a courthouse in Ottawa watching him be led away in handcuffs. But here I am. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 63 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in Nepean, and for the last 4 years, I gave everything I had to a son who decided I was worth more as a bank account than as a father. I retired early, not by choice. My back gave out after 28 years working for the city, inspecting roads and bridges in weather that would make most people quit after a week. I walked away with a decent pension. Not rich. Comfortable. Enough to pay my mortgage, keep my car running, take my sister out for breakfast on Sundays, and maybe, every few years, visit my daughter in Vancouver. That was my life. Quiet, manageable. Mine. My son. My older one, Marcus, he always had expensive taste. Even as a teenager, he'd look at other kids' sneakers and come home sulking. I didn't think much of it then. Kids are kids. You want things you can't have. You grow out of it. Marcus did not grow out of it. He married young, 26, to a woman named Diane, who had similar ideas about what life owed her. They bought a house in Kanata that was, frankly, more house than 2 people with their incomes needed. Marcus worked in sales for a tech company. Good money, but not house in Kanata plus 2 leased vehicles money. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I figured they were managing. People figure it out. For the first few years of their marriage, things seemed fine between us. We'd have dinner every couple of months. Marcus would call on my birthday. He came to my sister's retirement party. Normal family stuff. Nothing close, but nothing broken either. Then, 3 years ago, the calls started changing. It wasn't dramatic at first. He'd mention, casually, that Diane's car needed work, that they'd had a rough quarter, that the mortgage rate had gone up. I'd listen, say something sympathetic, and he'd move on. I didn't think he was asking for anything. I thought he was just talking. Then one Sunday he called and didn't bother with small talk at all. "Dad, I need to borrow $5,000. I remember standing in my kitchen, still holding my coffee mug, and just staring at the wall for a second. "What for?" I asked. He said they were behind on a credit card and the interest was killing them. He said it was temporary. He said he'd pay me back within 6 months, guaranteed. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I transferred the money. Because he was my son. Because you help your family. Because I told myself $5,000 wasn't going to change my retirement, and if it helped him get stable, then it was worth it. He didn't pay it back in 6 months. He didn't mention it again at all, actually. And for a while, neither did I. I kept waiting for him to bring it up. A text, a transfer, even just an acknowledgement. Nothing. 6 months became a year. I told myself I'd bring it up gently at Christmas dinner. Christmas dinner. He asked me for another $3,000. That time, I said no. I said it politely. I said I was sorry, but I wasn't in a position to keep lending money I wasn't getting back. He got quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't sad. It's cold. He said he understood, and then he found a reason to leave early. And I spent Christmas evening alone watching the hockey game, wondering if I'd done something wrong. That was the version of Marcus I still thought I understood. Disappointed, maybe a little entitled, but still my son. I had no idea what was coming. Last February, he called me on a Tuesday evening. This was unusual. He almost never called on weekdays. I picked up thinking something was wrong, maybe something with Diane or the house. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk. Can I come over Saturday?" I said of course. I made a pot of chili. I cleaned the house. Part of me thought maybe he was coming to apologize, to acknowledge the money, to tell me things were turning around. I am not embarrassed to admit I was looking forward to seeing him. I miss my son, even the difficult version of him. He showed up Saturday afternoon with Diane. She sat down at my kitchen table like she was in a meeting room and folded her hands in front of her, and I remember thinking that was a strange way to sit in your father-in-law's home. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was a venue, Some kind of banquet hall, modern, all glass and wood, the kind of place you see on those wedding planning websites. "We're renewing our vows," he said, "for our 10th anniversary. We want to do it properly. With a reception, a photographer, the whole thing." I nodded slowly. "That sounds nice," I said, and I meant it. 10 years is something worth marking. Then he told me what it cost. $35,000. I put down my spoon. "Marcus," I said carefully, "that's a significant amount of money." "We know," Diane said, and she said it in a way that communicated she had already decided how this conversation was going to go. "That's why we're here. We were hoping you could contribute." I asked how much they had in mind. Marcus said 20,000. "I want you to understand what that number means to a 63-year-old man on a city pension. $20,000 is not a contribution. It is not a gift. It is a significant portion of the financial cushion I had spent 3 decades building, carefully, so that I would not be a burden to anyone in my old age. $20,000 was the buffer between me and a crisis I couldn't predict. A medical bill, a furnace that gives out, a car that dies on the 4/17 in January. I told him I couldn't do it. I said it as gently as I knew how. I said I was proud of them for reaching 10 years, and I would be happy to give them something meaningful within reason. But $20,000 was not something I could part with at this stage of my life. Marcus looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 16, and I told him he couldn't go to a party. "Dad, you have money. You've always had money." I told him my pension wasn't unlimited and that I had already given him $5,000 that I hadn't seen returned. That was a mistake, not because it was untrue, it was entirely true, but because it lit something in Marcus that I had never seen before. Not the sulky teenager, not the cold, distant adult. Something older and uglier than both. He stood up from the table. "You're going to bring that up now?" His voice had gone tight. "After everything we've been through? After everything Diane and I have had to deal with while you've been sitting here comfortable in this house?" I told him to lower his voice. He did not lower his voice. He started listing things. The cost of living in Ottawa, the interest rates. How unfair it was that I'd bought my house when prices were reasonable and he had to pay triple what I did. How other fathers helped their kids without keeping score. How I'd always held the money over him like a threat and he was sick of it. I sat very still. I have learned over 63 years that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not move. "Marcus," I said, "I think you should go home." He didn't go home. What happened next? I have gone over it many times. I have tried to find the moment I could have done something different, said something different, moved in a different direction. I haven't found it. He grabbed my wrist, not the way you grab someone to get their attention. He grabbed it hard, twisting it, and when I pulled back and stood up, he shoved me. Both hands, flat against my chest, and I went back into the kitchen counter and knocked the pot of chili off the burner. It hit the floor. I remember the sound of it. I remember the heat of the steam. Diane stood up and said his name sharply. That's the only thing she did. Marcus looked at me, and for a second I thought it was over. I thought he'd realized what he'd done, and it was over. "You deserve this," he said. "You've always kept things from us. You're selfish. You've always been selfish." Then he turned around and left. Diane followed him without looking at me. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. My wrist was already bruising. The chili was cooling on the floor. I could hear my own breathing. I didn't call Marcus that night. I didn't call anyone. I cleaned up the kitchen, wrapped my wrist in a tensor bandage I had in the bathroom, and I sat in my living room until it was dark. What I didn't know then, what I only found out 3 weeks later, was that my kitchen had not been the only place Marcus had been that winter. 2 months before he came to my house, Marcus had started spending time with an elderly man in Barrhaven, a widower, 81 years old, living alone. His name was Walter. Marcus had met him through a side business he'd started. Some kind of home renovation referral service, the kind that sounds legitimate until it isn't. Walter had paid Marcus $6,000 for renovation work that was never done. Walter was not the only one. There were 4 others, all of them over 75, all of them living alone. All of them had written checks to a numbered company that Marcus controlled. None of the work had been completed. A few of them had been told the delays were due to supply chain issues, a phrase that, in 2023, still had enough currency to buy a few extra months. I learned all of this because of a phone call. My daughter called me from Vancouver on a Sunday morning, which is unusual for her. She texts, mostly. She asked me if I knew what Marcus was doing. I said I didn't know what she meant. She said she'd gotten a call from a cousin who worked in financial compliance and had seen something that worried her. She told me to check a website. It was a warning posted by a seniors advocacy group in the Ottawa area. It described the pattern exactly. The company name was different from what I expected, but the address, when I looked it up, was Canada. It was Marcus. I sat with that information for 2 days. I want to be honest with you about those 2 days, because I think people imagine that when you discover something like this about your child, you immediately know what to do. You don't. You sit in it. You look at old photographs. You think about the gravel road in Muskoka and the Civic and the way he laughed when he first figured out how to steer. You think about every moment you might have missed, every year you might have given him something different that would have changed this. And then you pick up the phone. I didn't call Marcus. I called the Ottawa Police Service non-emergency line. I told them what I knew. I gave them the website, the company name, Walter's name. I had found him through the advocacy group's contact and my own account of what had happened in my kitchen, including my wrist. I had photographs of my wrist, as it turned out, because my daughter had told me to take them the night it happened. She'd said it quietly, at the end of a call, almost like an afterthought. She knew before I did that I might need them. The officer I spoke with was a woman named Constable Reed. She was patient and thorough. She asked me to come in and make a formal statement, which I did the following week. What I didn't expect was how quickly it moved. By April, I received a call telling me that Marcus had been formally charged. Fraud over $5,000. 3 counts. Assault. There was a court date. I was asked if I intended to provide a victim impact statement. I said I would need to think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about whether giving that statement would be for justice or for anger, and whether there was a difference, and whether it mattered. I thought about my other son, who lives in Thunder Bay and had nothing to do with any of this, and who called me every week through all of it, steady and quiet, never pushing. I thought about what I wanted Marcus to hear from me, if anything at all, and whether the courtroom was the right place to say it. In the end, I decided I would speak, not because I wanted to wound him, because Walter deserved someone speaking, because the other 4 people Marcus had taken from deserved someone speaking. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Provincial courthouse on Elgin Street, the kind of building that smells like old carpet and fluorescent lights. I wore my good jacket. I sat in a row of wooden seats and waited. When Marcus came in, he looked smaller than I remembered. He didn't look at me. I gave my statement standing at a small podium. I had written it out and read it carefully. I talked about my wrist. I talked about my wrist. I talked about the chili on the floor. I talked about my pension and what $20,000 actually means to a man my age who has no one left to fall back on. I talked about Walter, who I had by then met twice for coffee and who had told me he was ashamed even though he had no reason to be. I did not talk about the Civic or the gravel road. Some things are not for courtrooms. The judge, Honorable Justice Claire Fontaine, sentenced Marcus to 18 months, with eligibility for release under supervision after 12. He was ordered to make restitution to all 5 victims. There was a period of probation to follow. Diane was not charged. There was insufficient evidence that she had known, though I have my own thoughts about that which I will keep to myself. Marcus looked at me once as he was being escorted out. I don't know what he was hoping to find in my face. I kept it still. I drove home alone on the 417. It was a clear afternoon, cold but bright, the way Ottawa gets in early spring when the light is sharp and everything looks a little raw. I stopped at a Tim Hortons on Merivale and sat in my car in the parking lot with a medium double-double, and I did not cry exactly, but I sat there for a long time. My younger son called that evening. He didn't say much. He asked if I was okay. I said I was managing. He said he'd come down the following weekend and we'd go to the Senators game if I wanted. I said that sounded good. I think about Walter sometimes. He told me, the second time we had coffee, that the worst part wasn't the money. He said the worst part was that for a few weeks, he thought Marcus was a friend. He thought someone had chosen to spend time with him. At 81, living alone, that matters more than people realize. I understood exactly what he meant. I am not going to tell you that I've made peace with all of it. I don't think peace is the right word. What I have is clarity. I know who my son became, and I know that I am not the reason he became it, even though I will probably spend the rest of my life turning that over. What I also know is this. I worked 28 winters for the city of Ottawa. I walked bridges in January winds that cut through every layer you have. I raised 2 boys mostly alone after their mother left. I saved carefully, and I asked for nothing from anyone. Nobody gets to take that from me. Not even someone I taught to drive on a gravel road in Muskoka, a long time ago, when I still believed there was nothing in him to be afraid of. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. More time than I expected, honestly. You think that once the legal part is done, once the judge reads the sentence and the doors close, you'll feel something clean. Relief, maybe. Or grief. Something with a clear edge to it. It's not like that. What I feel, most days, is a quiet kind of weight. Not guilt. I've been careful to separate guilt from grief, because they are not the same thing, even though they can feel identical at 3 in the morning. What I feel is the particular heaviness of a man who did everything he was supposed to do, and still ended up standing alone in a courthouse watching his son be led away. But here's what I've come to understand about Marcus. And about myself, and maybe about people in general. Choices compound. That's the only way I know how to say it. Marcus didn't become someone who defrauds elderly men overnight. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to grab his father's wrist and shove him into a kitchen counter. It happened slowly, across years, across small decisions that each seemed manageable in the moment. The first time he borrowed money and didn't pay it back. That was a decision. The first time he looked at Walter as an opportunity instead of a person, that was a decision. And every time he told himself he deserved more than he had, that the world owed him something it wasn't delivering, he moved a little further from the man he could have been. I'm not saying this to excuse anything. I'm saying it because I think it's the most important thing I learned from all of this. The person you become is not a sudden event. It is a long series of small surrenders to the worst version of yourself. And the same is true in the other direction. I worked 28 winters for the city, not because I loved cold weather or because the work was glamorous. It wasn't. I did it because I had 2 boys to feed and a mortgage to carry and a belief, quiet but firm, that you show up and you do the work regardless of how you feel about it. That's not heroism. That's just what decent people do. And that decency, those decades of showing up, is what let me sit in that courtroom with something intact. My wrist healed. My pride didn't need to. What I think about now is Walter, 81 years old, sitting across from me at a coffee shop on Merivale, telling me the worst part wasn't the $6,000. The worst part was that he'd thought he'd made a friend, that someone had chosen him. I keep coming back to that because it says something true about what we all need, at any age. Not just money, not just security, but the sense that we matter to someone who isn't obligated to say so. Marcus chased money because he thought it would fill something. It never does. It never has. The people I have known who lived well, genuinely well, not just comfortably, were people who understood that your integrity is the one thing you carry with you everywhere, and the one thing nobody can take unless you hand it over yourself. I didn't hand mine over. That's not a small thing. At 63, sitting alone in a Tim Hortons parking lot on a cold March afternoon with a medium double-double going lukewarm in my hand. That is not a small thing at all.